Judge Whitfield's gavel crashes down as armed officers seal the courtroom doors. 5-year-old Zara's single-word "daddy" has frozen everyone in shock. The man she pointed to isn't her adoptive father, but Marcus Jenkins, a complete stranger according to court records. Something dangerous just began. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready to discover how one child's innocent word exposed a corrupt system that tore apart countless black families for profit. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. Zara Thompson was a bright-eyed 5-year-old black girl with an infectious laugh and a passion for drawing colorful butterflies that decorated the refrigerator of her foster home. For 3 long years, she had bounced through the foster care system, her small suitcase becoming more worn with each move, her smile a little dimmer with each transition. That was until Thomas and Rebecca Sullivan, a respected white couple from the affluent neighborhood of Oakwood Hills, applied to adopt her after fostering her for 18 months. The Sullivans presented the picture-perfect image of an ideal family ready to welcome a child in need. Thomas, 52, was a successful real estate developer whose company had transformed abandoned buildings into luxury apartments across the county. His charitable foundation made regular donations to children's causes, earning him a reputation as a community benefactor. Rebecca, 48, had left her executive position at a marketing firm to become a full-time mother to Zara. Their sprawling colonial home with its manicured lawn swimming pool and dedicated playroom seemed like a fairy tale setting for any child. On paper, the Sullivans were everything the system could hope for in adoptive parents. They attended every parenting class, completed all required home studies with flying colors, and even organized cultural education events to ensure they could properly support a black child in their predominantly white community. Their photo album documented Zara's time with them meticulously, her first day of preschool in a crisp uniform, birthday parties with expensive gifts, trips to museums and amusement parks, and quiet moments of bedtime stories in her preschool. Elaborately decorated princess-themed bedroom. The transformation in Zara was visible to everyone involved in her case. When she had first arrived at the Sullivans, she had been withdrawn and wary, clinging to her tattered stuffed rabbit, the only constant companion throughout her young life. Now she appeared to be thriving. "Zara has really blossomed under their care," remarked her preschool teacher during an evaluation interview. "She's made friends and participates in class activities." The Sullivans are always the first to volunteer for school events. The community praised the Sullivans widely, though their compliments often revealed subtle racism that went unchallenged. "It's so noble of them to take in one of those children," whispered a neighbor at a community fundraiser. "They're really saving her from a life of poverty and who knows what else." Another commented, "She's so well behaved for a child from her background. The Sullivans must be doing something right." These undercurrents of prejudice flowed beneath the surface of what appeared to be a heartwarming adoption story. Few questioned whether there might be more to the picture than what the Sullivans presented. One person who harbored doubts was Judge Whitfield, a seasoned black judge with 27 years on the family court bench. Known for her thoroughness in adoption cases, Judge Whitfield had seen too many placements fail when appearances didn't match reality. She had earned both respect and resentment for her extensive questioning and detailed review of each case that came before her. "Children are not accessories or good deeds," she often stated firmly when lawyers tried to rush her proceedings. "They are human beings deserving of our utmost diligence." On the morning of the adoption hearing, the Sullivans arrived at the courthouse an hour early. Thomas adjusted his silk tie nervously, while Rebecca smoothed imaginary wrinkles from her conservative navy dress. Between them stood Zara in a puffy white dress with satin ribbons, her hair arranged in neat braids adorned with matching ribbons. "Remember to smile and answer clearly if the judge asks you questions," Thomas instructed, his hand firmly on Zara's shoulder. "Yes, sir," Zara replied quietly, her eyes cast downward. Rebecca knelt to her level, adjusting a slightly crooked ribbon. "After today, you'll be a Sullivan forever. Won't that be wonderful?" she asked with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Zara nodded obediently but said nothing. Waiting near the courtroom doors was Janelle Washington, the social worker assigned to Zara's case for the past year. A dedicated professional with a master's degree in social work and 15 years of experience, Janelle had lingering concerns about the adoption that she couldn't quite articulate. Something about the Sullivans' perfectionism unsettled her. She had noticed how Zara became unnaturally still and quiet in their presence, how her spontaneous laughter disappeared when Thomas entered a room. But her department, predominantly staffed by white administrators, had made it clear that the Sullivans were considered ideal candidates. "We need more successful placements like this one," her supervisor had commented when Janelle tried to request additional home visits. "Don't create problems where there aren't any." The pressure to approve was intense, especially given Thomas Sullivan's connections to county officials who oversaw department funding. As they entered the courtroom, Janelle noticed Zara suddenly freeze in the doorway, her eyes widening as she stared at someone seated in the back row. Before Janelle could see who had captured the child's attention, Rebecca had already ushered Zara forward to their seats at the front of the courtroom, whispering something in her ear that made the child's shoulders tense. Visibly. The adoption hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock, with the formal proceedings that had become routine in Judge Whitfield's courtroom. The oak-paneled room with its high ceilings and imposing bench created an atmosphere of solemnity, appropriate for decisions that would alter lives forever. Court reporter Sandra Mitchell's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, while bailiff officer James Rodriguez stood attentively by the door. The gallery was sparsely filled with a few court observers, law students, and what appeared to be friends of the Sullivans. Judge Whitfield entered, her black robe flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed the file before her. Case number 23-457. In the matter of the adoption of Zara Thompson by petitioners Thomas and Rebecca Sullivan, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the room. The Sullivans' attorney Lawrence Bennett approached the podium with confident steps. "Your Honor, we're here today to finalize what has been a beautiful journey for my clients. The Sullivans have opened their hearts and home to Zara, providing stability and opportunities she might never have had otherwise." His choice of words carried subtle implications about Zara's worth and potential outside the Sullivans' influence, a common microaggression that Judge Whitfield had noted repeatedly in transracial adoption cases. When Janelle Washington was called to testify about her home studies and recommendations, the subtle racial dynamics in the room became more pronounced. "Miss Prey," Washington Bennett began, "you've been involved in this case for approximately 12 months, correct?" Janelle nodded. "Yes, I was assigned after Zara had been with the Sullivans for about 6 months. And would you say the Sullivans have provided excellent care for Zara?" Bennett's tone suggested there was only one acceptable answer. "They've certainly provided materially for all her needs," Janelle replied carefully. "I've observed that Zara has adequate food, clothing, educational support, and medical care." Bennett's smile tightened. "Just adequate. The Sullivans have enrolled Zara in the prestigious Oakwood Academy. They've provided cultural enrichment through museums and even a heritage camp last summer. Wouldn't you characterize that as exceptional rather than merely adequate?" Judge Whitfield intervened. "Mr. Bennett, please allow the witness to characterize her observations in her own words." Bennett nodded with barely concealed irritation. "Of course, Your Honor." When Janelle attempted to mention her concerns about Zara's emotional withdrawal, Bennett quickly redirected with questions about the Sullivans' material provisions. Throughout the questioning, it became increasingly clear that Thomas Sullivan's connections had influenced the proceedings. References to his friendship with County Commissioner Gerald Wilson peppered Bennett's statements, along with reminders of Sullivan's generous donations to family service organizations. Judge Whitfield observed the proceedings with growing discomfort, noting how Zara sat unnaturally still between her prospective parents, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes rarely lifting from the floor. After testimonies from the Sullivans' character, witnesses including the director of the private adoption agency who had facilitated the placement, Judge Whitfield called Zara forward to ask her a few age-appropriate questions, AWW, practice she maintained despite criticism from attorneys who preferred children to remain silent during proceedings. "Zara, Would you please come up here and talk with me for a moment?" Judge Whitfield smiled warmly, gesturing to the space beside her bench where a small chair had been placed. Thomas Sullivan gave Zara a slight nudge, and she walked forward, her patent leather shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. "Hello, Zara," Judge Whitfield said gently. "I'm Judge Whitfield." "Do you know why you're here today?" Zara nodded solemnly. "For adoption," she whispered. "That's right." "And do you understand what adoption means?" the judge asked, leaning slightly forward to hear the child's soft voice. It was at this moment that everything changed. Instead of answering the question, Zara's eyes suddenly darted to the gallery, her small arm extended finger pointing directly at a man seated in the back row. "Daddy," she said, her voice suddenly clear and certain, echoing through the now silent courtroom. The single word fell like a thunderbolt. Rebecca Sullivan gasped audibly, while Thomas half rose from his seat, his face flushing dark red. The man Zara had pointed to stood up, his expression a mixture of shock and vindication. He was a tall black man in his early 30s, dressed in a simple but neat button-down shirt and slacks. "Zara," he called, starting to move forward. Chaos erupted immediately. Thomas Sullivan shouted for security, while Bennett demanded the man be removed. Officer Rodriguez moved swiftly to intercept the stranger as he tried to approach the front of the courtroom. Janelle Washington stood frozen, her case file clutched to her chest as she stared from Zara to the man and back again, recognition slowly dawning on her face. Judge Whitfield's gavel came down with 3 sharp cracks that cut through the disorder. "Order, I will have order in this court." Her commanding voice silenced the room instantly. "Officer Rodriguez, secure that man, but do not remove him." She turned to her clerk. "Call additional security to the courtroom immediately." Within minutes, 3 more officers had arrived. Judge Whitfield made a decision unprecedented in her career. "This court is now in lockdown. No one enters or leaves until I determine what's happening here. Clear the gallery except for essential participants in this case." As security began ushering observers out, Judge Whitfield pointed to the man Zara had identified. "You, sir, will remain. Please be seated at the respondent's table." The man was escorted to the table normally reserved for contested adoption cases. Thomas Sullivan rose to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This man has clearly manipulated Zara. He's disrupting a proceeding that's been in motion for months. We demand he be removed immediately." "You are not in a position to demand anything in my courtroom." "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Whitfield replied firmly. "Please be seated." Once relative order had been restored, Judge Whitfield addressed the stranger. "Sir, please state your name for the record." "Marcus Jenkins, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady, despite the tension in the room. "And what is your connection to this child?" "I believe she's my niece, Your Honor, my sister's daughter." "I've been searching for her for 3 years." Thomas Sullivan scoffed loudly. "This is preposterous. There's no mention of any uncle in Zara's file. This man is clearly lying." Judge Whitfield silenced him with a stern look. "Mr. Jenkins, do you have any identification?" Marcus produced his driver's license, which Officer Rodriguez brought to the judge. She examined it carefully before returning it. "Mr. Jenkins, do you understand the seriousness of interrupting an adoption proceeding? If you're making false claims, there could be legal consequences." "I understand, Your Honor," Marcus replied. "But I've been searching for my niece since my sister Tiana died 3 years ago. The children were supposed to come to me, but they disappeared into the system. I've been fighting to find them ever since." "Children? There were others?" Judge Whitfield asked sharply. "Zara has 2 older brothers, Jamal and Dion. They were 7 and 9 when they disappeared. I've been trying to locate all of them." The revelation sent another shockwave through the courtroom. Janelle Washington stepped forward tentatively. "Your Honor, there's no mention of siblings in Zara's file. She's been classified as a single-placement child with no known relatives." Judge Whitfield's expression darkened. "Miss Washington, please retrieve Zara's complete file immediately." "Mr. Jenkins, we'll need to verify your claims. In the meantime, this adoption proceeding is temporarily suspended." As the tension in the room intensified, Marcus revealed something else that changed the trajectory of the case entirely. "Your Honor, I'm not just looking for my niece. I'm a community activist with the Equal Justice Initiative. For the past 2 years, I've been investigating corrupt practices in this county's child welfare system that disproportionately remove black children from their families. I believe Zara's case may be part of a much larger problem. What sinister forces could be at work in a system designed to protect children? How could a loving uncle lose all trace of his niece for 3 years, despite active searching, if you believe our child welfare system needs more transparency? And accountability comment number 1 right now. If you think family ties should always be prioritized in placement decisions, hit that like button and subscribe to support stories that expose injustice. The day after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Judge Whitfield convened a closed hearing in her chambers. Present were Marcus Jenkins, the Sullivans, and their attorney, Janelle Washington, court-appointed guardian ad litem, Patricia Chen, and Detective Alicia Carter, from the county's Special Victims Unit. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Whitfield issued her first order. Before we proceed further with any adoption matters, I'm ordering immediate DNA testing for Mr. Jenkins and Zara to verify the claimed biological relationship. Miss Chen, as guardian ad litem, you'll supervise this process. Thomas Sullivan immediately objected. Your Honor, this is completely unnecessary. The adoption has already been approved by the department. This man appears out of nowhere with unsubstantiated claims, and you're delaying a loving home for Zara. Judge Whitfield fixed him with a stern look. Mr. Sullivan, establishing the truth is never unnecessary. If Mr. Spracel Dazen and the terrorist Proplus date ever 7. Jenkins is not related to Zara, the process will continue. If he is, then we have a very serious situation regarding falsified records and denied family placement. While they awaited the test results, Marcus Jenkins shared his 3-year journey to find his sister's children. Following the sudden death of his sister Tiana from an undiagnosed heart condition, Marcus had immediately filed for custody of his niece and nephews. As their only living relative and a stable homeowner with a good job as a computer programmer, he should have been the automatic placement choice. I had everything ready for them, Marcus explained, his voice tight with emotion. I converted my home office into a bedroom for the boys. I had a pink room set up for Zara with butterflies on the walls because Tiana told me those were her favorite. I took family leave from work to help them transition. But when I went to pick them up from temporary emergency placement, they were gone. The worker told me they had been placed in foster care and I would need to apply through proper channels. What followed was a bureaucratic nightmare that seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate family reunification. Every time I submitted paperwork, something was wrong or missing. Files were lost. Appointments were canceled. I was told I needed to complete parenting classes, then the classes would be full or scheduled during my work hours. I was told visitation was being arranged, then informed the children had been moved to new placements. I hired an attorney who filed motions for family placement, but hearings were delayed repeatedly. As Marcus continued his account, he revealed how the system had separated the siblings, despite regulations prioritizing keeping siblings together. Eventually, I discovered Jamal had been placed with a family in the next county. When I finally got a hearing about him, I was told he was bonded with his foster family, and removing him would be disruptive to his development. They terminated my sister's parental rights without proper notice to me as next of kin. Marcus had managed to eventually gain visitation with Jamal, though the adoption by his foster family had been finalized. He was still searching for Dion, who seemed to have vanished entirely from the system's records. It was during his increasingly desperate search that Marcus connected with other black families experiencing similar obstacles in the foster care system. I met parents and grandparents who had lost children to the system over minor issues that white families received support services for. I met aunts and uncles and cousins who were denied placement of family members for reasons that made no sense. We started documenting patterns, filing complaints, and that's when I connected with the Equal Justice Initiative. We've been investigating systemic racism in child welfare decisions across the county. Detective Alicia Carter, a no-nonsense veteran of the Special Victims Unit with 16 years of experience, had been assigned to investigate potential fraud in the adoption proceedings. She listened carefully to Marcus's account, occasionally making notes in a small black notebook. When he finished, she asked, "When did you first become aware that Zara was with the Sullivans? I didn't know until yesterday," Marcus replied. "I've been attending every adoption hearing in the county for months, hoping to find either Zara or Dion. When I saw her walk in, I almost couldn't believe it. She's grown so much, but I recognized her immediately. She looks just like Tiana," Thomas Sullivan interrupted with a dismissive wave. "This is all very touching but entirely fabricated. If Mr. Jenkins were really searching so diligently, how did he not find Zara before now? We've had her for 18 months. Bennett, the Sullivans' attorney, jumped in with a new angle of attack. "Your Honor, we've taken the liberty of investigating Mr. Jenkins' background. He has multiple arrests for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, clearly indicating a pattern of antisocial behavior unsuitable for a guardian." Marcus straightened in his chair. Those arrests were at peaceful protests against housing discrimination and police brutality. The charges were dismissed in every case. Nevertheless, Bennett continued smoothly. His involvement with activist organizations raises serious concerns about his stability and judgment. Judge Whitfield held up her hand. "Mr. Bennett participating in constitutionally protected protests does not disqualify someone from family placement consideration. Let's stick to relevant facts." She turned to Janelle Washington. "Miss Washington, did you ever receive any information about potential relatives of Zara during your handling of this case?" Janelle hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I was assigned the case after the initial placement with the Sullivans. The file I received indicated she was eligible for adoption with no known relatives. When I asked about family search efforts, my supervisor told me that had already been thoroughly handled, and to focus on the current placement stability. Judge Whitfield's expression darkened. "And who was your supervisor?" "Walter Kramer, the assistant director for permanency planning." The judge made a note. "Miss Washington, is there anything else about this case that concerned you?" Janelle glanced nervously at the Sullivans before answering. "I submitted several reports, noting that while Zara's physical needs were well met, she seemed unusually subdued in the Sullivans' presence. I recommended additional psychological evaluation, but was told the department's resources needed to focus on problem placements, and this one was proceeding well." Before further discussion could continue, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope. Judge Whitfield opened it carefully, read the contents, then looked up at the group. "The preliminary DNA results confirm that Marcus Jenkins is Zara's maternal uncle. There is no question of biological relationship." The revelation landed like a bomb in the small room. Rebecca Sullivan paled visibly while Thomas leapt to his feet. "This is absurd. Those tests can be manipulated. We demand independent verification." Detective Carter studied the Sullivans with new intensity. "Mr. Sullivan, your reaction seems extreme for someone who supposedly had no knowledge of this child's family. Most people would express surprise, not anger, at discovering a child in their care had a living relative." Judge Whitfield turned to her clerk. "Please contact the Department of Children and Families. I want every document related to Zara Thompson and her siblings on my desk by tomorrow morning, and schedule an emergency hearing for tomorrow afternoon." As the meeting concluded, Marcus approached Zara's guardian ad litem. "When can I see her? It's been 3 years." Patricia Chen replied gently. "I'll arrange a supervised visit as soon as possible, Mr. Jenkins. But we need to proceed carefully. Zara recognized you yesterday, which is remarkable given how young she was when you last saw her, but sudden changes could be traumatic for her." As they left the chambers, Detective Carter fell into step beside Marcus. "Mr. Pizet. Jenkins, I'd like to hear more about this investigation you've been conducting. I have a feeling we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here." The large ceremonial courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse was packed to capacity for the emergency hearing called by Judge Whitfield. News of the dramatic interruption to the Sullivan adoption had spread quickly through legal circles, drawing attorneys, social workers, and court observers eager to witness the unfolding case. Judge Whitfield entered promptly at 1 o'clock, her expression grave as she surveyed the crowded room. This hearing is called to address serious concerns about the pending adoption of Zara Thompson and potential violations of family placement protocols. In light of yesterday's confirmed DNA results establishing Marcus Jenkins as Zara's maternal uncle, the adoption proceedings are officially halted pending further investigation. She then addressed the immediate question of Zara's placement during the investigation. At this time, Zara will remain with the Sullivan family under supervision by the Department of Children and Families with mandatory daily checks. Mr. Jenkins will be granted supervised visitation 3 times weekly. This arrangement is temporary, while we determine the full facts of this case. Thomas Sullivan visibly fumed, but remained silent as his attorney noted their objection to the visitation order. Judge Whitfield then invited Marcus to share his sister's story for the record. Marcus stood composed but emotional as he recounted his sister Tiana's life and the circumstances that led to her children entering foster care. "My sister was a dedicated mother who worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children after her husband was killed in a construction accident. She had no life insurance and was struggling to make ends meet while fighting the construction company for workers' compensation. When she fell behind on rent during this battle, their apartment lost heat during a particularly cold winter. A teacher noticed the children seemed cold and reported the family to Child Protective Services. Marcus explained how instead of receiving emergency housing assistance or utility payment help that was ostensibly available through county programs, Tiana was deemed neglectful, and her children were removed on an emergency basis. She was given a reunification plan that required her to secure appropriate housing, maintain steady employment, and complete parenting classes. She did everything asked of her, working extra shifts to save for a security deposit on a new apartment, attending every class, never missing a visitation. But the goalposts kept moving. The apartment she found was deemed too small. Her work schedule was called unpredictable because she took available shifts to maximize her income. She was making progress on every front when she collapsed at work and died from an undiagnosed heart condition. His voice broke slightly. She never got her children back despite doing everything humanly possible to meet the department's requirements. And after her death, I was denied placement despite being blood family financially stable and fully prepared to raise her children." As Marcus shared photos of Zara's life before foster care, the contrast to the narrative presented by the Sullivans became stark. Images showed a happy, animated child surrounded by loving family at birthday parties, community events, and holiday gatherings. The picture of a neglected child from a troubled home that had been subtly painted throughout the adoption process was clearly false. Detective Carter then presented her preliminary findings regarding Thomas Sullivan's business connections. "Your Honor, investigation has revealed that Mr. Sullivan is not merely a donor to children's causes as previously represented, but is in fact a founding board member and 30% stakeholder in Bright Futures Adoption Agency, the private agency that facilitated Zara's placement with the Sullivans. This relationship was not disclosed in any of the adoption paperwork." She continued with the bombshell revelation. "Furthermore, Bright Futures has an exclusive contract with the county to handle special placement cases, receiving approximately $15,000 per successful adoption. The agency has placed 27 children in the past 18 months, with a notable pattern: 23 of those children were black or brown, and all were placed with affluent white families." The courtroom erupted in murmurs at this revelation, forcing Judge Whitfield to call for order. Meanwhile, the Sullivans had abandoned their initial strategy of dismissing Marcus's claims and moved to a more aggressive stance. They had hired Wilson Gregory, one of the most powerful attorneys in the state, with deep connections to both the judicial system and county politics. Gregory's first move was to file a motion questioning Judge Whitfield's impartiality. "Your Honor, given your public statements about racial disparities in the foster care system, we believe there may be an appearance of bias in this case. We respectfully request that you recuse yourself and that this matter be reassigned to ensure complete neutrality." The thinly veiled threat was clear to everyone in the courtroom. The Sullivans were prepared to use their considerable influence to control the narrative and the legal proceedings. Judge Whitfield's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Gregory, My statements about documented racial disparities in foster care and adoption are based on statistical evidence, not personal bias. Your motion is denied. This court will continue to oversee this case with the impartiality that all parties deserve. As the hearing progressed, Janelle Washington provided testimony that further illuminated the systemic issues. When I raised concerns about Zara's emotional state and requested additional evaluation, I was told by Mr. Pleist, end of Trap 6-7, Kramer, that the Sullivans were important community partners and that my role was to facilitate the adoption, not create obstacles. When I persisted, I was removed from 2 other cases and threatened with a performance review. The pressure on Judge Whitfield intensified outside the courtroom as well. That evening, she received a call from the Chief Judge of the Circuit, Richard Hamilton, a longtime colleague who rarely interfered with individual cases. "Elaine, I'm hearing concerns about the Sullivan adoption case. Commissioner Wilson called me personally to express his confidence in the Sullivans as adoptive parents. Perhaps a more expedient resolution could be found. This kind of public scrutiny isn't good for the department or the court." Judge Whitfield's response was glacial. "Richard, are you suggesting I ignore evidence of potential fraud and denial of family placement rights because a county commissioner is uncomfortable? Because that sounds remarkably like asking me to violate judicial ethics." The conversation ended abruptly, but the message was clear. Powerful interests were aligning against the investigation. The pressure extended to Marcus and Janelle as well. Marcus found a typed note on his car windshield: "Drop the case or face consequences. Some stories should stay buried." Janelle received anonymous texts warning that her career would be destroyed if she continued to cooperate with the investigation. Despite these intimidation tactics, the next supervised visit between Marcus and Zara revealed the undeniable bond that remained between them. Though initially shy, Zara gradually warmed up as Marcus gently reminded her of memories they shared. "Remember how we used to make butterfly pancakes on Sundays when you stayed overnight at my house? Your mom would bring you over and you'd help me mix the batter." Zara's eyes lit up. "With chocolate chips for spots on the wings," she said softly, a small smile forming. "That's right," Marcus replied, his own eyes glistening. "You have such a good memory." By the end of the visit, Zara was sitting beside him, looking through photos of her mother and brothers that Marcus had brought, asking questions and sharing fragmented memories from before her time in foster care. Patricia Chen, observing the interaction, made detailed notes about the positive engagement and Zara's animated responses, in stark contrast to her subdued behavior around the Sullivans. When Thomas and Rebecca arrived to pick her up, the transformation was immediate and troubling. Zara's shoulders tensed, her expression became neutral, and her voice returned to the quiet, careful tone she used in court. "Time to go home," Zara Thomas said firmly, not acknowledging Marcus. "Say goodbye now." "Goodbye, Mr. Jenkins," Zara said formally, the connection of moments before seemingly forgotten as she obediently took Rebecca's outstretched hand. The Sullivans' control over Zara was evident, raising new concerns about emotional manipulation and potentially coercive parenting techniques. As Detective Carter's investigation deepened, the web of connections between Thomas Sullivan, Commissioner Wilson, and key department officials became increasingly clear. The pattern went beyond Zara's case, suggesting a systematic effort to direct Black children away from family placements and into adoptions with wealthy white families, generating substantial fees for bright futures and enhancing Thomas Sullivan's reputation as a savior for underprivileged children. The battle lines were clearly drawn, with powerful forces working to maintain the status quo against a growing coalition determined to expose the truth and reunite Zara with her rightful family. The offices of the Special Victims Unit were quiet at 6 a.m. when Detective Alicia Carter unlocked the door to her small workspace, a cup of strong black coffee in hand. She had been working nearly around the clock since Judge Whitfield assigned her to investigate the Sullivan adoption case, and the web of connections she was uncovering grew more disturbing with each passing day. Spreading her files across her desk, she connected red threads between photographs of key players on her investigation board. Thomas Sullivan's company, Sullivan Development, had established a charitable foundation 5 years earlier that quickly became a major donor to children's causes throughout the county. Financial records showed the foundation donated $50,000 annually to the Department of Children and Families for a modernization project that included digitizing records and implementing a new case management system. Conveniently, the software company that received the contract for this modernization was partially owned by Sullivan through a subsidiary holding company. More disturbing were the financial connections between Sullivan's businesses and Bright Futures Adoption Agency. While Sullivan's 30% ownership stake was concerning enough, Carter had discovered that the agency had paid consulting fees totaling over $300,000 to Sullivan Development over the past 2 years. Consulting on what Carter muttered as she sipped her coffee, circling the figures on the financial statement. The pattern was becoming clearer. Sullivan used his foundation to gain influence within the department, installed his own record-keeping system that gave him unusual access to information about available children, then profited both from placement fees through Bright Futures and additional consulting fees routed back to his main company. The door opened, and her partner, Detective James Morales, entered with another stack of files. "Found something interesting," he said, placing a spreadsheet on her desk. "Compared the kids placed through Bright Futures with those placed through county services. Notice anything?" Carter scanned the data and immediately saw it. Bright Futures placed mostly black and brown kids, all with white families' average income over $200,000. County services placed mostly white kids, mixed placement demographics average income under $80,000. Morales nodded. "And guess which groups received the most post-placement support services and which had the highest disruption rate when issues arose?" As the investigation progressed, Marcus faced an orchestrated character assassination in local salve.com media. The Westridge Chronicle, owned by a business associate of Sullivan's, ran a front-page profile titled "The Troublemaker, Marcus Jenkins' History of Confrontation." The article highlighted his arrests at protests without mentioning the charges were dismissed, suggested his software engineering career was unstable despite his 6 years at the same company, and quoted anonymous sources claiming he had a temper and anti-authority attitude that would make him an unsuitable guardian. Meanwhile, Janelle Washington was conducting her own investigation into Zara's case files, driven by growing suspicion about how the case had been handled before her involvement. Requesting access to the original intake documents required navigating bureaucratic obstacles clearly designed to discourage scrutiny. When she finally received access to the digital records, she discovered troubling discrepancies. The original intake notes mentioned Zara telling the emergency placement worker about her Uncle Marcus and his butterfly pancakes. Janelle explained to Judge Whitfield during a private meeting. But those comments are missing from the official record that was forwarded to family court. Similarly, there's documentation of Marcus contacting the department multiple times in the weeks following his sister's death, but no record of follow-up or family placement assessment. Most damning was the discovery of a deleted case note that Janelle recovered through the system's audit trail. The note, written by a now-retired social worker, explicitly stated, "Child has maternal uncle Marcus Jenkins, who is willing and appears suitable for placement, forwarding information for expedited family placement evaluation." This note had been deleted by Walter Kramer 2 days before Zara was placed with the Sullivans as a foster to adopt case. While the investigation progressed, the Sullivans launched a sophisticated public relations campaign. They appeared on local morning television, presenting themselves as loving parents, fighting against a system suddenly prioritizing biology over the stable home they had provided. "We've loved Zara as our own for almost 2 years," Rebecca said tearfully for the cameras. "She calls us Mommy and Daddy. She has friends at school, a routine security. Now, all of that is being threatened because of a relative who never found her until our adoption day." Thomas spoke gravely about their commitment to Zara's cultural identity. "We've made sure she knows about her heritage. We have black friends, we attend cultural events. But now we're being painted as somehow inappropriate parents because we're white. If that's not reverse racism, I don't know what is." Their narrative found sympathetic ears, particularly among those who viewed transracial adoption as an unmitigated good, and were uncomfortable with discussions of systemic racism in the child welfare system. Letters to the editor and social media campaigns sprouted in support of the Sullivans, many using language that revealed troubling attitudes. "These children are better off with families who can provide opportunities," wrote one supporter. "Why return them to the same communities they were removed from?" The pressure on Judge Whitfield escalated from vague suggestions to explicit threats. She received a formal notice that the Judicial Review Board had received complaints about her handling of several cases, including the Sullivan adoption, and would be conducting an evaluation of her fitness to remain on the bench. The implied threat to her career was unmistakable. While adults fought political and legal battles, Zara became increasingly withdrawn. Patricia Chen reported that during her home visits, Zara spent most of her time in her room speaking little and showing none of the animation she displayed during visits with Marcus. "She's drawing disturbing pictures," Chen noted, showing Judge Whitfield artwork depicting a small stick figure in a cage while larger figures stood outside. When I asked her about them, she said she wasn't allowed to talk about before or the man in court because it would make Mr. Thomas angry. A court-ordered psychological evaluation revealed signs of emotional manipulation. "Zara shows indications of what we call loyalty conflict," explained Dr. Melissa Rayburn, the child psychologist who conducted the assessment. "She's received messages that expressing affection for her uncle or memories of her mother will displease her foster parents. She's internalizing the idea that her past is somehow bad or shameful, which is developmentally harmful." As Marcus continued working with the Equal Justice Initiative, he discovered other Black families with stories disturbingly similar to his own. James and Letitia Brooks had lost their nieces to adoption despite filing for custody. Michael Thompson's grandchildren had been placed with white families in different states, despite his consistent efforts to keep them together under his roof. In each case, paperwork was lost. Hearings were delayed and stringent requirements were imposed that weren't applied to white family members seeking placement in similar situations. "They're deliberately breaking apart our families, erasing our children's connections to their culture and community." Marcus told a group of affected families gathered in a community center meeting room, and they're profiting from it. Each of these adoptions generates thousands in fees and positive publicity for people like Sullivan. The meeting was recorded by an undercover reporter from the Westridge Chronicle, who published a distorted account claiming Marcus was inciting racial hostility and undermining the adoption system. The next day, Janelle Washington was called into Walter Kramer's office and informed that she was being placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into unauthorized access of confidential records and unprofessional communications with clients. Her department credentials were confiscated, and security escorted her from the building as colleagues watched in shocked silence. That evening, as she walked to her car in the darkened parking garage of her apartment building, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning quickly, she found Detective Carter stepping out of the shadows. "Don't react," Carter said quietly. "Keep walking to your car. We need to talk, but not here. We have reason to believe you're in danger." Once inside Janelle's car, Carter explained, "Someone broke into my office last night. They were careful, but they disturbed the files on the Sullivan case. Today, Judge Whitfield's clerk found signs that her chambers had been searched as well. Whatever you've discovered, it's made some powerful people very nervous. Is it possible that a system designed to protect vulnerable children could be weaponized against families of color? Could respected community leaders be orchestrating a modern form of child trafficking disguised as charitable adoptions? If you believe we need more oversight of our foster care system, comment number 1 below. If you think family preservation should be the priority rather than quick adoptions, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories exposing injustice. What happens next in this investigation will shock even the most cynical observers. Detective Alicia Carter sat in her unmarked police cruiser outside the offices of Bright Futures Adoption Agency, watching as employees departed for the evening. Once the building was mostly empty, she made her way inside, flashing her badge to the security guard. "Special Victims Unit. I need access to the records department." armed with a search warrant signed by Judge Whitfield Carter and a small team of officers, began systematically reviewing case files for every adoption facilitated by the agency in the past 3 years. By midnight, they had assembled a disturbing pattern. 27 cases, with nearly identical profiles. Carter briefed her captain the next morning. Black children from families experiencing temporary hardships, minimal documented efforts to place with relatives, fast-tracked adoptions to wealthy white families, all generating premium fees. Most disturbing were the connections between these cases and others handled by Thomas Sullivan's preferred caseworkers at the Department of Children and Families. The same names appeared repeatedly: Walter Kramer, supervisor; Lisa Daniels, intake specialist; Robert Prescott, family court liaison. All had received promotions or performance bonuses during the period when the suspicious adoptions increased. But here's where it gets interesting. Carter continued placing a stack of financial records on the captain's desk. Sullivan Development received consulting fees from Bright Futures for each successful placement. Those fees were then partially donated back to the department through Sullivan's foundation, earmarked for staff development programs that just happened to include Caribbean retreats attended by these same employees. Captain Garcia let out a low whistle. "You're building a case for corruption, kickbacks, and potentially fraud." Carter nodded. "And given the racial pattern of these placements and the deliberate obstruction of family reunification for black families, I believe we can make a case for civil rights violations as well." While the police investigation gathered momentum, Marcus organized a community response that grew more powerful by the day. Working with the Equal Justice Initiative and local civil rights organizations, he assembled a coalition of affected families who shared their stories publicly. They held a peaceful demonstration outside the Department of Children and Families, carrying signs with photos of children separated from relatives and statistics about racial disparities in the county's foster care system. The event drew media attention from beyond the local market, bringing national news crews to cover what was becoming a significant civil rights story. "This isn't just about my niece," Marcus told reporters. "This is about a systematic dismantling of black families under the guise of child welfare. These are our children, our future being taken from us for profit." The growing publicity forced county officials to acknowledge the allegations publicly. Commissioner Gerald Wilson held a press conference flanked by department leadership to announce an internal review of adoption procedures. "We take these concerns seriously," Wilson stated, his rehearsed sincerity failing to mask his discomfort. "The welfare of children is our highest priority, and we will ensure all placements follow proper protocols." Behind the scenes, however, evidence suggested a desperate attempt at damage control. Judge Whitfield received an unexpected visit from Judge Richard Hamilton, who had approved many of the suspicious adoptions. "Elaine, this is getting out of hand," he said, closing her office door. "The department is under siege. Sullivan is threatening lawsuits against the county. The commissioner is worried about re-election. Surely we can find a compromise that addresses concerns without this public spectacle." Judge Whitfield regarded him coldly. "Richard, are you suggesting we cover up potential crimes to protect political careers? Because that sounds remarkably like obstruction of justice and judicial misconduct." Hamilton's face flushed. "I'm suggesting discretion. These cases are complex. Decisions were made with the best information available at the time. Were they?" Judge Whitfield challenged. "Because I'm looking at substantial evidence suggesting information was deliberately withheld or altered to facilitate these adoptions." "How many of Sullivan's cases came before you, Richard? How many family placement requests did you deny in favor of his clients?" Hamilton left without answering, but the implication was clear: the conspiracy reached into the judiciary itself. Meanwhile, Rebecca Sullivan was experiencing growing doubts about her husband's methods. The pressure of the investigation and Zara's increasing withdrawal had created tension in their marriage. Late one evening, she made a decision that would dramatically alter the case's trajectory. She contacted Janelle Washington through a burner phone, purchased specifically for this purpose. "I need to talk to you," Rebecca said when Janelle answered. "Not at my house, not on a recorded line. There are things you should know." They met at a 24-hour diner 30 miles outside the county, where Rebecca handed over a flash drive. "It's all here," she said, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. Thomas's records his agreements with Kramer and Wilson, the system they created to identify desirable children and fast-track them to wealthy clients. I didn't understand at first. He told me we were helping children escape poverty, giving them opportunities. But then I found his private files, saw the money changing hands, realized how they were deliberately keeping families apart. Her voice broke. There are notes about how to make sure black relatives fail home studies instructions for caseworkers on finding minor issues to disqualify family placements. It's all so calculated, so cold. When Janelle asked why Rebecca was coming forward now, her answer was simple: Zara cries for her uncle at night. She hides it from Thomas, but I've heard her. She remembers her family. I wanted a child, but not like this, not by stealing someone else's. The evidence Rebecca provided became the cornerstone of an expanding investigation. The FBI became involved investigating potential human trafficking aspects of the case. While these children weren't being trafficked in the traditional sense, explained FBI Special Agent Catherine Monroe, the systematic removal of children from families of one racial group, the financial benefits derived from these removals, and the deliberate obstruction of family reunification meet several criteria for human trafficking under federal statutes. As the case built against Thomas Sullivan and his co-conspirators' business associates began distancing themselves, Sullivan Development lost contracts and board members resigned from his foundation. The Bright Futures Adoption Agency was placed under state supervision pending investigation outcomes. Judge Whitfield finally granted Marcus supervised custody visits, with Zara allowing them to spend time together outside the formal visitation center. Their reunion at a local park was emotionally powerful, with Zara initially hesitant but quickly warming as memories surfaced. "You used to push me really high on the swings," she told him, as they sat on a bench sharing ice cream. "All the way up to the sky." "That's right," Marcus smiled. "And you were never scared, even when your mom would tell me to be careful. You've always been brave, Zara." As their relationship strengthened, Zara began sharing concerning details about her time with the Sullivans. "Mr. Thomas gets mad if I talk about before," she confided during one visit. "He says, 'My old family didn't want me, but that's not true, is it? You were looking for me.'" "Every single day," Marcus assured her. "I never stopped looking for you and your brothers." The mention of her brothers brought both pain and hope. There had been progress in locating Jamal, now living with a family in the neighboring county. His adoptive parents, unlike the Sullivans, had been unaware of any improprieties in his placement and were distressed to learn he had been separated from siblings. They had agreed to meet with Marcus and discuss maintaining connections between the children. Dion remained missing, but new leads suggested he might have been placed in another state through an affiliated agency. Outside the courthouse, community support for Marcus and other affected families continued to grow. Protesters gathered daily, their numbers swelling as the story spread. "Keep families together and black children are not commodities," read signs carried by a diverse group of supporters. Local churches, civil rights organizations, and community action groups joined the coalition demanding accountability and system reform. The pressure was building on all fronts when Detective Carter narrowly escaped what was clearly an attempt on her life. Leaving the precinct late one night, she noticed a car with tinted windows following her. Years of police training kicked in as she took evasive action, but on a deserted stretch of road, the vehicle accelerated and tried to force her car off an embankment. Only her defensive driving skills prevented a potentially fatal crash. The incident removed any doubt that the investigation had touched powerful interests, willing to go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. Security was immediately assigned to key figures in the case, including Marcus, Janelle, and Judge Whitfield. The attack on Detective Carter also served to accelerate the investigation, as the department now treated the case as attempted murder of an officer. Search warrants were expedited, and surveillance was approved for primary suspects. The net was closing around Thomas Sullivan and his co-conspirators when Rebecca made another fateful decision. "I'll testify," she told Detective Carter during a confidential meeting arranged through her newly hired attorney. "I'll tell everything I know about the scheme, the payments, the falsified records. I can't be part of this anymore." The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as FBI agents escorted Thomas Sullivan through a side entrance away from the crowd of reporters and protesters gathered at the main steps. Dressed in an expensive suit rather than handcuffs, Sullivan maintained the appearance of a respectable businessman, but the gravity of his situation was evident in the tight set of his jaw and the security details surrounding him. Inside a conference room, U.S. Attorney Eliza Cortez laid out the federal government's interest in the expanding case. Mr. Sullivan, we're investigating potential violations of several federal statutes: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of civil rights, and elements that potentially constitute human trafficking. The evidence gathered so far is substantial, and additional charges may follow as our investigation continues. Sullivan's high-priced attorney Wilson Gregory maintained his client's innocence while suggesting openness to cooperation. My client is a respected philanthropist who has devoted considerable resources to improving child welfare in this county. Any irregularities in documentation or procedures were administrative oversights, not deliberate actions. U.S. Attorney Cortez was unmoved. Administrative oversights don't generate millions in profits or systematically target specific racial groups, Mr. Gregory. Your client can cooperate fully now or face the maximum penalties later. The choice is his. As federal authorities built their case, Rebecca Sullivan's cooperation became increasingly valuable. In a private meeting with Detective Carter and FBI agents, she revealed the extent of her husband's operation and her growing concerns over the past year. At first, I truly believed we were helping children find stable homes, she explained, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Thomas presented it as rescuing kids from neglectful situations. But then I noticed patterns. All the children were black or brown. All went to wealthy white families who made substantial donations to Thomas's foundation. Her suspicions had grown when she overheard Thomas on the phone with Walter Kramer discussing a promising prospect shortly after a black mother had been arrested for leaving her children alone while working a night shift. He said something like, "Fast-track this one, Walter. The Prestons are willing to go to $100,000 for a baby girl under 2. It sounded like they were discussing a transaction, not a child's welfare. Most disturbing were the coded terms used in emails between Sullivan Kramer and Commissioner Wilson. They referred to the children as inventory and families willing to adopt as premium clients. There was a price structure based on age, gender, and what they called adaptability traits. Rebecca's voice broke. Lighter-skinned children with manageable hair commanded higher donations. It was like a catalog. When she confronted Thomas with her concerns, he had dismissed them with practiced ease. He said I was being naive, that this was how the system worked, that these children were better off with our kind of people who could provide opportunities their communities never could. He made it sound like he was saving them, but he was profiting from tearing apart families. Rebecca agreed to wear a wire during conversations with her husband, capturing damning statements about his methods and motivations. She also provided access to private financial records showing how funds flowed through various entities to conceal the true nature of payments. Meanwhile, Marcus's community organizing efforts continued to gain momentum. Working with the Equal Justice Initiative, he established a support network for families affected by the corrupt system. Weekly meetings in a church basement grew from a handful of participants to standing-room-only gatherings where families shared resources, emotional support, and strategies for navigating the complex legal system. National civil rights organizations had taken notice, providing legal assistance and publicity that elevated the local struggle to a national conversation about racial bias in child welfare. The meetings became a powerful space for healing and action, with affected families moving from isolation and despair to collective empowerment. During one particularly moving session, an elderly grandmother named Esther Williams shared how her 3 grandchildren had been taken and placed with separate families after her daughter's imprisonment on minor drug charges. They said my apartment was too small, even though the children had lived with me their whole lives whenever my daughter was struggling. They said at 72, I was too old to raise young children, ignoring that I'd already raised 4 of my own and 2 grandchildren before these 3. Each time I completed a requirement, they added new ones until the children were labeled legally free for adoption. Stories like Esther's confirmed the systematic nature of family separation in the county's child welfare system, particularly for Black families. Marcus had used his technical skills to create a database documenting patterns across cases, revealing how specific caseworkers, judges, and officials appeared repeatedly in problematic adoptions. This evidence was now being reviewed by civil rights attorneys preparing a class action lawsuit on behalf of affected families. Judge Whitfield faced escalating pressure as she continued to oversee Zara's case and others identified as potentially fraudulent. A formal complaint had been filed against her, with the Judicial Ethics Committee orchestrated by Sullivan's remaining allies. The complaint alleged biased procedural irregularities and overreach in her handling of adoption cases. Though baseless, the complaint required a response and investigation that consumed valuable time and energy. Despite these challenges, Judge Whitfield remained resolute. "The integrity of our family court system is at stake," she told her clerk, after a particularly difficult day. "If we allow wealth and influence to determine which families deserve to remain intact, we've abandoned our fundamental responsibility to protect children's best interests." Progress in the case accelerated when Marcus finally gained custody rights to visit Zara regularly. Their reunion was emotional for both, with Zara initially shy, but quickly remembering the special bond they had shared before her removal from the family. During these visits, supervised by Patricia Chen, Zara gradually opened up about her experiences with the Sullivans. "Mr. Thomas made me practice what to say to the judge," she confided during one visit. "He said I should never talk about you or Mommy or my brothers. He said those were bad memories, and I needed to forget them to be happy." Chen documented these conversations, carefully building evidence of psychological manipulation that would further strengthen the case for family reunification. Outside the courthouse community, protests continued to grow. What had begun as a small group of affected families had expanded to include clergy teachers, healthcare workers, and concerned citizens from across the county. Daily demonstrations maintained pressure on officials while raising public awareness about the systemic issues at play. Local news coverage, initially skeptical or hostile, began to shift as the evidence mounted and more families came forward. Even the Westridge Chronicle, previously aligned with Sullivan's interests, published an investigative piece titled "Questions Surround County Adoption Practices" that acknowledged the troubling patterns in transracial adoptions. Detective Carter's investigation uncovered the financial incentives that had fueled the corrupt system. Thomas Sullivan's Connected Adoption Agency received average fees of $35,000 per placement, with additional consulting fees flowing back to Sullivan personally. The county received increased federal funding for each successful adoption, creating a perverse incentive to move children quickly to adoption rather than family reunification. Meanwhile, Commissioner Gerald Wilson had received substantial campaign contributions from Sullivan and his associates, along with personal benefits, including a vacation home purchased through a shell company connected to Sullivan Development. As Sullivan's business partners began distancing themselves to avoid being caught in the expanding investigation, the web of corruption became increasingly exposed. One former board member of Bright Futures, seeking leniency, provided emails documenting how the agency specifically targeted Black children for placement with wealthy white clients, marketing these placements as saving children from the cycle of poverty while charging premium fees. The federal investigation expanded to include Judge Hamilton, who had approved dozens of suspicious adoptions after receiving substantial donations to his re-election campaign from Sullivan-connected entities. A review of his cases revealed a pattern of denying family placement requests from Black relatives while fast-tracking adoptions to wealthy white families represented by Sullivan's agency. The breaking point came when Rebecca Sullivan, now separated from her husband and cooperating fully with authorities, agreed to wear a wire during a meeting with Thomas. Their conversation in an upscale restaurant, captured clearly by FBI surveillance, included damning admissions about the scheme. "Everything's falling apart because you couldn't keep your mouth shut." Thomas hissed across the table, unaware that every word was being recorded. "Do you have any idea what we've built here? We took those kids from nothing and gave them everything. The families paid good money for stable placements. Everyone benefited." "The children's actual families didn't benefit," Rebecca countered. "Marcus Jenkins spent 3 years searching for his niece. Those children were loved and wanted." Thomas's response revealed the depth of his racial bias. "Please, those kids are better off with us than in those neighborhoods. We're giving them a chance at a real future, not food stamps and project housing. It's practically a public service." The recording provided the final evidence needed for federal prosecutors to move forward with a comprehensive case against Sullivan and his co-conspirators. The early morning calm of Oakwood Hills was shattered as federal agents and local police executed simultaneous arrest warrants at multiple locations across the county. Thomas Sullivan was taken into custody at his attorney's office, where he had been strategizing his defense. Walter Kramer was arrested at his suburban home, still in his bathrobe, as neighbors watched from behind curtained windows. Judge Hamilton was allowed to surrender himself at the federal building, a courtesy extended due to his judicial position despite the severity of the charges against him. Commissioner Gerald Wilson tipped off about the impending arrests, attempted to flee, but was apprehended at a private airfield where a chartered jet had been waiting to take him to a country without extradition treaties. The coordinated operation marked a dramatic escalation in the case that had begun with a single word from a 5-year-old girl, U.S. Attorney Cortez held a press conference announcing the charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, violations of civil rights statutes, corruption of public officials, and elements constituting human trafficking under federal PIME law. Today's arrests represent the first phase of what we expect to be an expanding investigation, Cortez stated firmly. The evidence suggests a years-long conspiracy that systematically separated black children from their families for profit, falsified government records, and corrupted public officials sworn to protect our most vulnerable citizens. This case goes beyond criminal behavior by individuals. It exposes structural failures in our child welfare system that must be addressed. As the criminal case progressed, Zara was placed in temporary custody with a black foster family that had been thoroughly vetted by both the court and Marcus's attorneys. The Coleman family had extensive experience with trauma-informed care and had opened their home specifically to support children affected by the adoption scandal while family reunification processes were underway. Darlene Coleman, a retired pediatric nurse, and her husband James, a school counselor, provided the stable, nurturing environment Zara needed during the transition. "She's starting to smile more," Darlene reported during a case review meeting. "The nightmares are less frequent, and she's talking about her memories of her mother and uncle without the fear she showed initially. She's especially excited about the possibility of seeing her brothers again." The search for Zara's older brother Dion had finally yielded results through the expanded federal investigation. He had been placed with a family in Arizona through an affiliated agency, his records deliberately separated from his siblings to prevent family connections from being traced. Contact had been established, and plans were underway for a video call between the long-separated siblings. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own challenges in establishing his fitness as Zara's guardian. Despite the clear evidence of corruption in her adoption process, he still encountered systemic bias in the family court system. Home studies scrutinized his modest but comfortable 2-bedroom apartment with standards not applied to wealthier applicants. His work schedule as a software developer, though flexible and stable, was questioned regarding childcare arrangements. His past participation in protests was characterized as concerning behavior despite no criminal convictions. "We're seeing the same bias standards that enabled this corruption in the first place," argued Marcus's attorney Sophia Washington from the Equal Justice Initiative. "My client has a stable income, a suitable home, a flexible work arrangement that allows him to be present for his niece, and a strong community support network. The only deficit the department can identify is that he doesn't have the wealth and privilege of the Sullivan household." Judge Whitfield agreed, issuing a strongly worded ruling that addressed the double standards directly. This court finds that the department has applied inconsistent and potentially biased criteria in evaluating Mr. Jenkins' fitness as a guardian. The stability of a child's placement is not measured by square footage or luxury amenities, but by the presence of loving, committed caregivers and connection to family and cultural identity. The department will complete a new home study using standardized, equitable criteria within 14 days. As the criminal and family court proceedings continued, in parallel media coverage of the case evolved significantly. Initial reporting that had framed the story as a custody dispute between an adoptive family and a biological relative shifted to investigative pieces on corruption and systemic racism in child welfare. National news programs sent correspondents to cover what was now characterized as a landmark case with implications for adoption and family preservation policies nationwide. What began as one child's recognition of her uncle has exposed a troubling pattern of family separation that disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, reported a CNN correspondent standing outside the federal courthouse. Critics say these cases reflect a modern continuation of historical practices that have separated children of color from their families and communities, from slavery through the boarding school era to today's foster care system. Thomas Sullivan's defense strategy shifted as former allies became witnesses for the prosecution. His initial claims of administrative oversights and misunderstandings gave way to attempts to deflect responsibility onto others. "My client was not involved in day-to-day placement decisions," his attorney argued in court filings. He relied on department professionals to ensure all procedures were properly followed. If there were irregularities, they occurred at the departmental level, not through any action by Mr. Sullivan. This strategy collapsed when Rebecca Sullivan's testimony revealed Thomas's direct involvement in identifying desirable children and matching them with wealthy clients, willing to make substantial donations. Her testimony was particularly damning regarding the racial aspects of the scheme. Thomas specifically instructed the agency to focus on Black and brown children, because in his words, "white babies are too hard to come by, and the wait lists are too long." He viewed transracial adoption as an untapped market with better profit margins, because wealthy white families would pay premium fees and donations for what he called saving a child from the projects. Rebecca's testimony included documentation of how Thomas had specifically targeted Zara and her brothers after their mother's death, identifying them as prime placements because they were attractive, healthy children with no significant behavioral issues. When Marcus had begun searching for the children, Thomas had personally directed department employees to obstruct his efforts, recognizing that family placement would eliminate potential adoption fees. Commissioner Wilson's testimony, secured through a plea agreement, confirmed the political protection provided to Sullivan's operation. Sullivan was a major campaign contributor and influential figure in the community, Wilson admitted. When concerns were raised about his adoption practices, I directed department leadership to handle them quietly and expeditiously. In return, Sullivan ensured generous donations to my campaigns and personal financial opportunities through his business ventures. The testimony of these insiders revealed a conspiracy more extensive and calculated than initially suspected. The deliberate targeting of Black families, the systematic obstruction of family placement efforts, and the financial incentives driving these decisions painted a picture of modern-day trafficking disguised as charitable work. Most disturbing were the revelations about how children were essentially marketed to wealthy families based on physical characteristics, age, and perceived adaptability to white upper-class environments. As the federal case built momentum, state authorities ordered a comprehensive review of the county's adoption procedures. Governor Elaine Mitchell appointed an oversight committee led by respected child welfare experts and civil rights attorneys to examine past cases and recommend systemic reforms. The allegations in this case point to failures that extend beyond individual bad actors, the governor stated in announcing the committee. We must examine the policies, incentives, and oversight mechanisms that allowed such abuses to occur and ensure they cannot be repeated. The ceremonial courtroom of the federal building was filled to capacity on the morning of the final hearing in Zara's case. 3 months had passed since the arrests of Thomas Sullivan and his co-conspirators. The criminal proceedings were advancing through the federal system, with multiple defendants accepting plea deals in exchange for cooperation. Now, the family court aspect of the case would reach its conclusion under Judge Whitfield's careful guidance. National media occupied the back row their presence, underscoring the case's significance beyond one child's future. Civil rights leaders, child welfare advocates, and families affected by similar cases filled the gallery. Marcus Jenkins sat at the petitioner's table, dressed in a charcoal suit, his posture reflecting both hope and the weight of the 3-year battle to reclaim his niece. Beside him, his attorney organized documents for the proceedings. Across the aisle, Rebecca Sullivan sat alone. She had withdrawn her adoption petition and separated from Thomas, cooperating fully with authorities in both the criminal case and the family court proceedings. Her testimony had been crucial in establishing the deliberate fraud that had kept Zara from her family. Janelle Washington, reinstated to her position, with a formal apology from the department, sat in the front row of the gallery. Beside her was Detective Carter, whose investigation had expanded to identify dozens of similar cases across the county. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Whitfield entered and called the court to order. "Today we conclude proceedings in the matter of guardianship of Zara Thompson." She began, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. "This case began with a child's recognition of her uncle and has exposed systematic failures in our child welfare system. Before rendering my decision, I want to acknowledge the broader context in which this individual case exists." Judge Whitfield spoke eloquently about the historical and continuing impact of policies that disproportionately separate children of color from their families. From slavery through the boarding school era to current child welfare practices, we have seen systems that devalue the bonds of Black and Indigenous families. The evidence presented in this case suggests that, rather than addressing these historical injustices, some have chosen to exploit and profit from them. She then addressed the criminal aspects directly. This court takes judicial notice of the federal indictments against Thomas Sullivan, Walter Kramer, Judge Richard Hamilton, Commissioner Gerald Wilson, and 7 others for their roles in a conspiracy that deliberately separated Black children from their families for financial gain. Their actions represent a profound betrayal of the children they claim to serve and the public trust they were sworn to uphold. Turning to the specific matter before her, Judge Whitfield reviewed the evidence regarding Marcus's fitness as Zara's guardian. Mr. Jenkins has demonstrated unwavering commitment to his niece's welfare, maintaining his search for her, despite systematic obstruction. He has established a suitable home, arranged flexible work accommodations, and built a support network to ensure Zara's needs will be met. Most importantly, he has approached her recovery from trauma with patience, understanding, and respect for her experiences. The judge then addressed Rebecca Sullivan directly. "Miss Sullivan, your cooperation in this case has been instrumental in exposing the truth. Your willingness to acknowledge the harm caused, even when that acknowledgement implicated you personally, demonstrates moral courage that this court respects. Your continuing commitment to assist in Zara's transition shows genuine concern for her welfare rather than your own interests." Finally, Judge Whitfield turned to her ruling. Having considered all evidence and the recommendations of Zara's guardian ad litem, this court grants permanent legal custody of Zara Thompson to her maternal uncle Marcus Jenkins, effective immediately. The previous adoption proceedings are permanently vacated based on clear evidence of fraud and misrepresentation. The announcement was met with quiet tears from Marcus and applause from the gallery, which Judge Whitfield allowed briefly before continuing. Additionally, this court orders the Department of Children and Families to immediately implement the following measures. First, establishment of a specialized unit to review all adoptions facilitated by Bright Futures Adoption Agency or approved by officials implicated in the current federal investigation. Second, implementation of new protocols requiring documented family finding efforts before any child is deemed eligible for non-relative adoption. Third, mandatory training for all department personnel on cultural competence and implicit bias in family assessments. Beyond the individual case, Judge Whitfield announced broader systemic reforms. In my capacity as presiding judge of the Family Court Division, I am establishing a Family Justice Review Committee comprising affected family members, child welfare professionals, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates. This committee will audit past cases for similar patterns of discrimination and develop recommendations for equitable family preservation policies. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. Following Judge Whitfield's ruling, the state legislature passed the Family Preservation and Equity Act, requiring rigorous family-finding efforts, eliminating financial incentives for quick adoptions, and establishing independent oversight of transracial adoption practices. The Department of Children and Families underwent a comprehensive restructuring, with new leadership committed to addressing racial disparities in family separation and reunification rates. Janelle Washington, recognized for her courage in challenging corrupt practices, was appointed to lead the new Office of Family Preservation and Equity, responsible for implementing reforms and monitoring compliance with new standards. Her first initiative was a systematic review of all adoptions processed during Sullivan's influence, with support services offered to affected families. For Marcus and Zara, the journey toward healing continued one day at a time. Their reunion with Zara's brother Dion, facilitated by the FBI Victim Services Division, was emotionally overwhelming for all involved. The 10-year-old boy had been told his mother abandoned him and that he had no other family. Discovering his siblings and uncle represented both joy and profound grief for what had been lost. "We'll rebuild our family together," Marcus promised the children as they sat together in his living room surrounded by photos of their mother and extended family. "It won't be the same without your mom, but we'll carry her love with us and make a new life that honors her memory." With the support of trauma-informed therapists, cultural connection programs, and a community that rallied around them, the reunited family began the process of recovery. Zara's nightmares gradually decreased, and her natural exuberance returned. She spoke more freely about her memories of her mother and developed a close bond with her older brother. Regular video calls and visits with Jamal, who remained with his adoptive family but maintained connection with his siblings, helped restore the sibling bonds that had been deliberately severed. Through his experience, Marcus established the Family Reconnection Foundation, providing support resources and legal assistance to other families separated by similar practices. The foundation created a database to help locate children who had been placed for adoption under questionable circumstances and offered trauma-informed reunification support. Rebecca Sullivan, seeking redemption for her role in the corrupt system, became an unexpected ally in these efforts. Her testimony in the ongoing criminal trials helped secure convictions against major figures in the conspiracy, and her public statements about the racial bias inherent in the saving narrative of transracial adoption contributed to a more nuanced national conversation. In the final moments of the hearing that reunited Marcus and Zara permanently, Judge Whitfield offered a reflection that resonated beyond the individual case. True justice requires not only accountability for past wrongs, but commitment to repairing harm and preventing future injustice. The path forward must include acknowledging the pain inflicted by discriminatory systems, restoring family bonds where possible, and reforming institutions to truly serve all children and families with equal respect and care. As Zara left the courthouse hand in hand with her uncle, surrounded by supportive community members and finally free from the corrupt system that had nearly erased her family connections, her smile reflected not just personal healing, but hope for systemic change that would protect other families from similar separation. The single word she had spoken in court months earlier had ignited a movement for justice that would continue to grow long after her own case was resolved. What do you think about the systemic issues exposed in this story? Have you witnessed racial disparities in child welfare or other institutions in your community? Comment below with your thoughts and experiences. If you believe all families deserve equal protection and support, please like, subscribe, and share this story to raise awareness. Your engagement helps more people understand these critical issues. Thank you for joining me on this journey. through a difficult but important case that reminds us how powerful one voice can be when speaking truth to power. This story reveals how systems meant to protect children can be weaponized against vulnerable communities when corruption and racial bias go unchecked. The child welfare system designed to safeguard children became a profitable enterprise that systematically separated black families under the guise of saving children. It shows how racial prejudice can be disguised as benevolence, with wealthy white families positioned as saviors, while black families are deemed inadequate despite their love and capability. The power of a single voice. Zara's recognition of her uncle reminds us that even children can spark transformative change when truth breaks through deception. Marcus's persistence demonstrates how advocacy and community organizing can challenge entrenched systems, while Janelle and Detective Carter show the courage required to stand against corruption from within institutions. Judge Whitfield exemplifies how those with power can use their position to demand accountability rather than protecting the status quo. Rebecca Sullivan's eventual cooperation illustrates that reconciliation begins with acknowledging harm and working to repair it. Most importantly, this case teaches us to question narratives that devalue certain families based on race or class. True child welfare means strengthening families rather than separating them, preserving cultural connections rather than erasing them, and ensuring that systems serve all communities with equal respect, dignity, and justice. What systems in your community might be operating with hidden racial biases? Have you witnessed how wealth and privilege can override what's truly best for children and families? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe family preservation should be prioritized over quick adoptions that separate children from their communities and cultural heritage, hit that like button to stand with families fighting to stay together. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate resilience in the face of systemic challenges. And please share this video with anyone who works in education, social services, or family court. These stories need to reach those who can help create change. Thank you for bearing witness to this important story. Remember, justice begins when we refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths and commit to building systems that truly protect all families equally.